Sorry about that, everyone. We are back. I'll let John pick up where he left off just about a minute ago.
Thanks, Jenny. Sorry for the lost video. I think all of us during this pandemic are finding out the pluses and the minuses of this kind of transmission. So we'll hope to keep it the rest of the session. I think I was just talking about our action in more than 20 jurisdictions nationally currently. Since we've launched, we've been involved in more than 60 jurisdictions, and that training and technical assistance I was talking about, particularly the technical assistance approach, is a long-term relationship. So we're proud of how many jurisdictions we've partnered with, and that gives us the juice to tell you we know what works because of what you've done. And quite honestly, I think a lot of you already know, we've been active in Nebraska for a number of years in a number of jurisdictions, and we just treasure the relationship that we have with the stakeholders and the leaders in the state of Nebraska. We estimate that since we've launched, given the fact that we try to impact system reform, and this preamble, I hope it's not too much at this point, but the preamble is important to the very first poll question I'm going to ask you. So setting some things up here, but we estimate to have impacted as a result of the fact that our system improvement, we believe, impacts not only the work we do in that current year for that current population in that jurisdiction, but because it's policy and practice and systemic change, we argue that it may impact every youth who's referred to the juvenile justice system in those jurisdictions from when we started working with them, in some instances more than 10 years ago to now. And therefore we estimate that we may have had an impact, and I say we in the collective had an impact on over 150,000 youth in a positive way since we've begun our work in the field. We'll also attest to some very proven, some very desirable outcomes. I think that's important for all of us to share. I wouldn't want you to accept a premise or a theory. I would want you to understand how you can drive the change and then how you can report on the kind of impact that you had. All of that will be elements of the session today. And I'm looking forward to walking this information through with you. Before we get to the next slide, Jenny, if you could offer up the first poll question. So it's simply, in your estimation, when you refer to diversion, are you speaking about a program or an approach or practice? In this election era, it's awfully fun to watch the numbers change. So we'll have some of that fun throughout the session today because we've got a number of polling questions. Jenny, I can't quite tell when all the polling is in, all the numbers are in. And some of them are still changing.
It looks like we've had 30 voters so far. I can close the poll whenever you would like.
I'll give it another minute. I'm really interested in getting a few more responses there. In fact, you can tell me when we get to 40, if we get to 40, Jenny. Let's hold there. Let's get back into how I would respond to this. First, I'm not criticizing anyone who's among the 29% because that is what you refer to when you speak to diversion, and that's not unusual. But I'm going to do cartwheels in the same room with the 71% who define it or refer to it as an approach or a practice. The emphasis today is that if I'm going to offer what I argue is a roadmap to success around diversion, then today it's a diversionary approach. It's a practice among all of our stakeholders that work together to create a comprehensive approach to alternative responses or diversionary approaches, diversionary practices within our system. That'll become a little bit more evident to you as we walk through this. But it doesn't, I don't care what position you hold as you join us today, every one of you who's joining us today could have a leadership role, could provide the impetus for, could actually drive and charge action forward to create this roadmap to success for alternative responses for these youth that we go forward. So a big setup for the discussion today is that I prefer to refer to what we're going to talk about as an approach. And even as I say practice, it's a set of practices that maximize alternative responses for youth, alternative responses to formal prosecution and entry into the juvenile justice system. So, second slide, please, Jenny. We are featuring here on this slide a very simple depiction and the link to where you can find the Alternative Response Initiative workbook. This workbook, authored by me and my colleague, our Associate Executive Director at the RFK National Resource Center, Carrie Harp, resulted from that systemic work that we've been doing across the country around juvenile justice and probation system reform, and the recognition that there's an increased emphasis on diversion or alternative responses. But I'm going to offer the premise that it is often without measurable impact, often without provable results, and often underutilized, given what the research says about many of the aspects of penetration into the formal juvenile justice system. So the emphasis here, once again, is on the approach. And to be successful in the first part of this roadmap, I would argue that we have to embrace all community partners in the effort going forward. Now, it presents a unique set of challenges right off the bat. We'll get to that. But all community partners, all sources of referrals that might, as I hope you're thinking, would suggest it's certainly law enforcement. It may be family members. It's unfortunately all too often schools, although I don't want to editorialize that schools should be able to refer and work in partnership with the juvenile justice system. And certainly, as I know some of the participants on this session who were partners of mine, thankfully, and have led a successful approach to diversion, to alternative responses in Douglas County, we must embrace all sources of referrals that include child protection and child welfare as well. And additionally, this Alternative Response Initiative workbook, which will follow through on the process today, it's really laying out that roadmap that I referred to. It embraces not the single program, but it embraces the fact that alternative responses could include a restorative justice approach, restorative justice program, educational programs for youth about their involvement or about their behavior, support services. And there I'm referring to really pro-social support services, mostly in the community, but also in our schools, which we would call part of the community. You know what those are. I think most of you do. We're certainly talking about YMCAs. I would talk about it from the aspect as a former collegiate athlete of the value of interscholastic athletics and the involvement for youth, but certainly church groups and positive peer supports, but also treatment interventions. We're working in a couple jurisdictions right now. We're really emphasizing that part of this array of alternative responses also includes the fact that we should screen, maybe even preliminary assess for the kind of intervention services for mental health, for substance abuse, for family, those kinds of efforts, and not just divert, but divert to something. And that is often also inclusive of treatment interventions. So the Alternative Response Initiative workbook will be the guide for us as we walk through this session today, because we do think we laid out a roadmap that ensures that you get this comprehensive array of partners together in your community to develop a more comprehensive approach to diversion. And you embrace all kinds of diversionary practices, programs, and efforts as part of this work. It is truly a more, if you will, magnificent systemic approach to addressing the population of youth that would be better served outside the formal justice system. Let me ask Jenny if you could post the next poll question before we get to the next slide. Pardon me. So the neuroscience research on adolescent development confirms, and I ask you to offer your best answer here. Does it confirm the process of brain development from ages 13 to 18 years? Does it confirm that adolescents are less accountable for their behaviors? Does it confirm that adolescents are less capable of exercising judgment than adults? Or does it confirm none of those factors? Quite anxious to see your responses here. Jenny, I'll ask you just to kind of identify after these poll questions once we get to 30.
Sounds good.
Thanks.
Okay, we got to 30. I closed the poll.
Awesome. Thank you guys for being responsive to this. I want to keep you involved. I want to see what you're thinking because it'll inform kind of what we'll call a conversation today with you. The poll is your way of conversing with me as well as the chat box to ask questions. Just to keep you awake, there is a little bit of an adjustment for those 23% of you who answered process of brain development from ages 13 to 18. So there's a tricky to this. First of all, while there's no scientific description of adolescence to the detail, it's often recognized as from ages 10 to 17. And the neuroscience of research on adolescent development actually confirms the brain development, the process of brain development from age 6 through 24, which is the active period of, particularly in the prefrontal cortex, of many of the key characteristics that we're going to talk about that allow us to establish at RFK National Resource Center a strong foundation for how and when we most effectively intervene with youth. So thank you for having 0% that it says that adolescents are less accountable for their behaviors. That is not what it says. And unfortunately, I hear far too many people mostly arguing against this science being utilized in the treatment of youth, that's what it argues. It does not less accountable. 63%, I want to applaud, great response rate. It does confirm, this is the answer, it does confirm that adolescents are less capable of exercising judgment than adults, because in that prefrontal cortex, during this period of brain development, that is the area of the brain development that is less developed. So they are less able, and if you would, right now, Jenny, switch to slide 3. They are less capable of self-regulation in emotionally charged contexts. That's most of adolescents' lives, particularly in a school environment among peers. They have a heightened sensitivity to that positive and negative peer influence, which drives their actions more often than sound reasoning. And they are less able than adults to make judgments and decisions that require future orientation, less capable, less able to consider whether or not the action they're about to take has negative consequences in the future. That's not an indictment of youth. That's just what's going on in the brain, and that it's not fully developed at the time. It is that science with this publication that over time, I'll admit, I grew a little bit of frustration across the country with the fact that there was a lack of awareness about adolescent development and a lack of ability to be proficient in that understanding and translate it to everyday application in working with youth. Let me tell you what the science also says that's not on that slide. It says that youth, therefore, in this stage of life, are more malleable to change than adults. They are more capable of adjusting their decision-making process. They are more malleable and capable of learning new cognitive skills as they are not fully developed, that they can eventually implement as fully developed as they move forward. Those are positive signs. What this also says is that their behavior change during this malleable period is also more susceptible to incentives to change the behavior than sanctions. So I think that's an important foundational piece that we offer going forward. And it's really important for us to speak in those terms. We would argue that the adolescent characteristics provide the foundation for the adoption and implementation of developing informed practice, policy, and procedures that then translate to effective achieving of the primary responsibilities of the juvenile justice system. Now, this is where I'll pause. I don't know how many prosecutors, county attorneys, I don't know how many public defenders. I don't know all of the profile of everyone in the session today, folks. But the primary responsibilities of the juvenile justice system founded in the background of that statement are accountability, prevention of reoffending, fair and equitable treatment, and more recently, most systems add the responsibility and opportunity to promote positive behavior to reduce that risk. Those, we believe, fundamentally impact the way the juvenile justice system should respond. It's also important before we go forward, folks, to acknowledge that at one time or another, almost all adolescents engage in risky behaviors. If I could ask for a show of hands because we were in the same room, anyone that didn't raise their hand in response to that, I would probably call a liar. I would certainly be raising both of my hands. And therefore, it showed that during this period, we often act without thinking. We made bad decisions more often than we do as adults. And thus, many may actually engage in what would be judged as illegal behavior. Most youth are not apprehended every time they do so, but arrest is a common experience among adolescents. And in this approach, we have experienced significant success, by the way, with this facet. And that notion of most youth are not apprehended every time they do so, but arrest is a common experience, especially for youth of color in urban areas. Okay. Yet only a small percentage of those youth will ever be arrested for a second delinquent act. I hope you carry that belief forward, or a smaller percentage even will become repeat offenders, not only as an adolescent, but as an adult. Yet only, in other words, for the majority of youth who are arrested, their first delinquency is not a sign of future delinquency. And for most youth, the period of risky experimentation does not extend beyond adolescence, ceasing as identity settles with maturity. I hope most of you know. If you did not, my question is, did you know that 60% of youth who offend or are alleged to have committed an act of delinquency will never reemerge in our juvenile justice system again, even if it's just with no action? Now, that is a 25-year trend of the national data. Nearly 60% of youth will never reemerge after their first arrest. If we just stop there on that simplistic argument, we could make a case for why we have to extend the comprehensive opportunities for alternative responses and keep these youth out of the juvenile justice system. Could we possibly get the link? I see Jenny has already answered. The link is on there. I don't know if you can see the slide. And certainly we can follow up, although I think Jenny's already answered. Jenny, could you raise up the 2 poll questions prior to slide number 4? So first, according to credible research, aggression and delinquent behavior is near normative behavior, as evidenced by the fact that 8 in 10 males will have police contact in their adolescent life. True or false? I added a couple of components to this question just to make sure that I didn't give you the answer in my previous preamble. Aggression and delinquent behavior is near normative behavior. So that's a very interesting response. You can tell me when we get to 30. I may be reacting too early.
We got to 30. I closed it, so I will launch the next.
Okay. So while you're launching that next one, well, go ahead and launch the next one, please. Formal involvement in the juvenile justice system increases the risk of future reoffending. Anxious to see your response to this as well. Wow. The truths are way ahead in this one.
All right, we got 30 polls closed.
Thanks. Wow. So let me respond to the first one. It's interesting to me that less than half of you believe that aggression and delinquent behavior is near normative behavior. This is a research statement, a research-driven statement, and it captures more than one research study that estimates that of the male population in adolescence, 8 in 10 will have police contact during that period of adolescence. And I'm seeing that 55% of you felt like that was false. I think that's true. Now that we'll stay away from the editorial about how disturbing that is, but I think the answer to that question is more true than false based on the research. In fact, it was put into this session just to argue this premise. We should expect less ability to exercise good judgment, less ability in peer-induced circumstances, which is much of our adolescent environment. And the fact that it is part of aggression and delinquent behavior of males, adolescent males. Now that you have to trust the research to find that, but it kind of suggests that we should expect to see at least maladaptive behavior, if not delinquent behavior in adolescence. And with the other elements of the research, which we'll talk about here very briefly, it should suggest that not all of that has to be treated as if we must shut them down from creating that behavior. That, and I'm not suggesting you guys think that, but the argument here is that we should expect it. I have a 25-year-old who I have frequently spoken about that when he was 13 to 17, if I told him to do something once that I thought was the correct action, it took me at least 10 times that many times before he actually acted that way. So we should expect maladaptive behavior and delinquency from this premise that I'm building. And in many instances, we should expect that which escalates into that which could be determined and charged as delinquent behavior. And it doesn't mean, the basic premise here, it does not mean that we have to react in a real punitive way. Punitive sanctions have not proven to be good answers in the largest percentage of the cases. Formal involvement, it's interesting that nearly 9 out of 10 of you increase the risk of future reoffending. Sadly, the research continues to reaffirm that is true. And I know who I'm speaking to. There's half 100 of you, plus me, who has spent my entire career working in juvenile justice. And I've got to believe that what we're doing can help kids, can help youth and families, and can help protect the community and prevent reoffending. But unfortunately, formal involvement does increase the risk, not by a large percentage. Thornberry's research would suggest it's maybe 7 to 15% of an increase for the risk of future reoffending, but it's an increase nonetheless, and at least strengthens the case why we want to create this roadmap for alternative responses. I'm hesitating for just a second, pardon my stammering. I almost got caught thinking we were in the same room, and I was pausing for a second to see if there were any questions. So I'm missing that. I'm missing the face-to-face contact with you, individual contact as we go forward. Slide number 4, please, Jenny. So I'm going to hit you with a 777 on these next 3 slides, and we're going to get a little bit more quickly through these slides to get into that roadmap that I'm speaking to, trying to establish a foundation for you to believe you can make a difference and for you to argue how it is that you build the foundation for that difference. This first slide reinforces that there's studies on the impact of diversion from formal prosecution. You can read this. I want to share with you a little bit of narrative at this point as you look over those details. The maturation of research over the past 20 years has validated the ability of risk screening instruments to predict the risk to reoffend. Effective application of these instruments provides a systematic opportunity to identify youth that are appropriate for alternative responses and diversion programming. Okay, and I say predict And I say it offers an opportunity. It is not, as Dr. Gina Vinson continues to argue, it's not the single source, but it's part of an important body of information that allows us to exercise our structured, professional, and experienced judgment to use this instrument, this kind of risk screening, to identify who's at low risk to reoffend, who's at moderate, who's at high. And those low, the research would argue, don't belong in the juvenile justice system. Those moderate should be eligible for opportunities at alternative responses, and moderate to high make up the lion's share of those cases that, in the most instances, should be looked at with the opportunity or the chance or the position that we might need to petition that case and move them into the juvenile justice system. I didn't put this on the polling question, but I would say out loud, do we know generally what percentage of cases are misdemeanor and low risk and felony and high risk in your jurisdiction? Now, those are kind of two separate questions because, again, I'm emphasizing that we base decision-making not on offense type, but most jurisdictions do, as opposed to offense level of risk. But low risk, misdemeanor, high risk, moderate high risk, and felony, generally speaking, you're going to get 2 out of every 3 of your cases that are either low risk or misdemeanor type offenses, which should argue, generally speaking, that 2 out of every 3 cases should be eligible for some sort of diversion approach or an alternative response. At least we should have a systematic opportunity for looking at that as a first option and exercising that option before we introduce them to the higher risk of formal involvement in the juvenile justice system. So some of these bullets, there are 7 studies. I've just pulled out 3 to just try to tweak you just a little bit. I hope you were able to read number 2 and 3, youth who were diverted to services, that by the point of emphasis earlier in the community, had a lower reoffending rate than adjudicated youth, and that's compared with similar offenses. Number 3, the outcomes for those youth without services were not statistically different from non-diverted youth in reoffending rates. Okay, so again, just a little bit of detail for you to consider. More, perhaps, evidence that if you were leading this or driving this or trying to make the case for this systematic approach to comprehensive alternative responses, you have plenty of research, you have plenty of evidence as to why you need to broaden the opportunities. I wonder in your jurisdiction what the actual percentage is of youth that end up getting that chance to be diverted or to have some sort of alternative response. We're doing this work in the city of Milwaukee, the county of Milwaukee, and yesterday, what emerged in our early work there was only 26% of their youth are currently experiencing diversion opportunities, when 69% of their offense types and 66% of their risk levels are either low risk or misdemeanor offenses. Big gap, big opportunity there. Jenny, if you could offer the poll question prior to slide number 5. It's simple. In your opinion, not mine, in yours, decisions to provide an alternative response to formal prosecution should be based on offense type. I know I may have stacked the deck, but I want your honest answer. What did you come into this session thinking about how that should be applied? So is it true or false that it should be based on offense type? Interesting tug of war so far.
Okay, poll's closed.
Thanks, Jenny. Man, boy, this is where I really would love being in the same room with you. I'm someone, and some of you know, I'm okay with provocation and confrontation. And I think through respectful discussion, we come to resolution. This might be where we'd have just a little bit of dynamic engagement, because 56% of you say it should be based on offense type. And unfortunately, that doesn't comport with the research. when it's offense type that is our decision for an alternative, then we're less likely to identify those who are truly at risk for reoffending. Okay. There are some offenses that qualify as felonies that in the literature, in the research would suggest that they are very low risk to reoffend. And more specifically, being able to look at a risk screen that measures several factors about whether or not there is a risk to reoffend, as not as opposed to, but in addition to the offense type, provides us a greater opportunity to truly understand whether or not this youth is at risk to reoffend. I wish this poll were flipped, and I wish I had the opportunity for the 56% of you who said that it is true to have further discussion. And in fact, I welcome it in the future because we could dive a little bit more deeply into that. So the question just came up, does context matter? That's what I was just referring to, Kay. Context does matter. So indeed, where also in Milwaukee, we helped create the youth assessment team, which this code had allowed for nearly 20 years, but the district attorney there didn't want any of that context or risk screen level information when they were making their decision. So not only does this score matter, if you will, on a risk screen, but the context. Yes, in the youth assessment team, they're conducting at least a preliminary, a kind of a pre-screening or a pre-risk, even in some instances, a pre-assessment, and providing that context to the district attorney with a recommendation for whether or not this is an eligible case for an alternative response or a diversion. So yes, Kay, it does. The poll question is limited to get the conversation started, but I think that's very important that we have all of that context in informing these decisions. This pathway for introduction into the delinquency system, where we miss the opportunity to divert them, the youth that are formally prosecuted not only have higher risk of reoffending, but they also have higher rates of longer histories of deeper involvement in the juvenile justice system. And to the question that says, am I saying no matter what the offense? No, I am not. This is a partnership, and this will come true here very shortly. And I certainly see that it's hard to convince county attorneys of that. Yes, that's the issue. What we'll get to in this roadmap is that this has to be a collaborative discussion. You'll see very soon the partners have to be county attorney, the local court, the judiciary, law enforcement. We all have to be part of this discussion. That's why I've offered some of the research base, some of the foundational basis of why there might be wisdom in looking at this. Ultimately, in every individual jurisdiction, you're going to have to establish that there might be some offenses, to Carry On's question, there might be some offenses that we end up saying must be excluded from these alternatives. And it may be a class, it may be the felony offenses that you just can't get to a place where you consider those as eligible for alternative responses or diversion. Okay, so all the last three comments, all of those last three that I've reacted to, it ends up being an effort to try to find the balance in the local jurisdiction. But if we base it thoughtfully on risk screening, on the research about adolescent development, on the impact of formal involvement, it may give us a stronger foundation of identifying more opportunities to safely look at alternative responses, still hold that youth accountable, still attend to victims' rights, and still, in the end, protect that community, protect your own community. Many of you work in the community, that you live in the community in which you work. There's another comment here I want to react to and amplify. I think that statement about law enforcement or prosecutors to game, they often overcharge. I would imagine that's some of the basis of what you're offering in your comment there. And that overcharging may allow them to negotiate it down. We've seen that time and again in the jurisdictions where we've established these kind of processes. And hopefully by working in a collaborative fashion, if they trust more what they're going to get out of bringing these complaints forward about the youth in their community, where they're making allegations of delinquent behavior, then they'll charge the appropriate charge, knowing that they're going to get fair consideration of what should occur to attend to these shared interests in our community safety, accountability, protection, prevention of reoffending, and to provide services to reduce the risk. So great comments. Really appreciate your engagement. We're making this a conversation, even though it's my voice, unfortunately, you have to listen to. I'm going to move on to, this was prior to slide number 5. If you could move to slide number 5, Jenny, that would be very much appreciated. Okay, so what you're seeing here is, so that research that I was referring to came out of a research publication that even after the 3 or 4 major Supreme Court decisions that relied on adolescent development, adolescent neuroscience, US Supreme Court decisions, there was a little bit of flailing and hand-wringing about, so what do we do with this? And in fact, I was privileged to be a part of a committee that came out of this National Research Council report, asked to develop a plan, a strategic plan for implementation of this science into everyday practice. And this slide merely projects what we landed on with the second number 7 that I'm referencing. And it was 7 hallmarks to utilize that developmental approach to juvenile justice. So the first 2 really apply here. I was never described in my days as a probation officer or an intake officer here in a jurisdiction where I live in Fairfax County as soft or even a tree hugger, nothing like that. I was known as fairly straightforward, fairly strict. I believed you did this, then you had to do this to be accountable. But there are ways in which I've learned over the last 25, 30 years that we hold accountable youth. We hold youth accountable without criminalization more effectively than often we do when we criminalize by entry into the juvenile justice system. And that there are alternatives that actually work. And we now have evidence of these kinds of approaches that do work, that give us a greater sense that we could turn to that and prove that it works in our own local jurisdiction, as opposed to involvement in the juvenile justice system, which may project for more risk for future involvement going forward. It relies on an individualized response. Do the context matter? Do I say that no matter what the offense? No. An individualized response looks at that context, looks at that individual risk, not the risk solely based on the offense type. So that individualized response is based on this science of risk identification and needs identification. Several more here. Commitment, confinement only when necessary for public safety. Nebraska has obviously enacted a law last year that reduces the elements that permit detention for youth. This genuine commitment to fairness is about swift and certain justice. That's very important, to have a youth understand swift responses to their behavior is more likely to produce the accountability and the positive reaction than delayed responses and imprecise action. Sensitivity, disproportionality, and disparate treatment speaks for itself. And unfortunately, in most of our youth justice systems, many of those that don't get the opportunity to diversion or alternative responses are youth of color. And therefore, too often, our youth justice systems are overpopulated by minorities. And interestingly enough, this context question, this context has to do with family as well. So one of the core principles of effective juvenile justice practice is the family must be engaged. So it's important for us to learn what the family system, what the family situation, what the family structure, what the family's position is on these cases. It's an important part of us producing an effective alternative response should we go in that direction. I'm going to ask at this particular juncture if you would offer up the next poll question prior to my final slide of 7. Please identify your top 2 priorities for your commitment to alternative responses and diversionary practice. What would you put forward that would guide the way in which you would argue either for, hopefully for, out of this session, the increased reliance on alternative responses or diversion? Top 2 priorities. Awesome responses. Let me know, Jenny. This is cool. I'm gonna dive in, Jenny.
Okay, the poll's closed.
Got him? Thanks. Look, let me congratulate from my again, my opinion doesn't matter when you get back to doing the work that you do. But for today, I'm gonna at least share it. And I love the first two answers. Um, Actually, with this group, maybe I'm a little surprised that we're not trying to reduce recidivism, that only half of you answered that, since you had two opportunities to include that. Um, I think I would argue it's one of our primary responsibilities. Now, I realize that's the second poll answer, so I get that. But I appreciate that we've got to reduce recidivism. It goes back to the accountability without criminalization, and certainly protection of public safety. Yes, we want to reduce recidivism. I love the fact that there's an 83% response rate that says, well, and I think I'm going to interpret this way, it says we need to provide some sort of intervention, some sort of treatment or service or support in order to achieve what we want to achieve with alternative responses. Suddenly, the emergence of this group as one of my favorite groups of all time is coming to bear now that 83% of you are wanting to provide treatment and intervention services. Some of that early research about the fact that if we provided effective interventions, and we can prove that those interventions do impact their rate of recidivism or their positive change in behavior, that when we apply those, the research changes. The research indicates that, in fact, properly applied, appropriately targeted, we can reduce recidivism by making sure that we're connecting them to the right treatment and intervention services. Love it. And I can't pass in this environment where nearly every jurisdiction, sadly, that we're working in is reflecting huge disproportionality for minority youth. I appreciate that at least 1/3 of you, more than 1/3 of you, included that in one of your top two priorities. It is up to you as we walk through this pathway here, coming right up, to identify what your primary motivations are and find those motivations among the groups that you're working to, if you will, hook your collaborative partners into really being committed stakeholders. That's some of what this poll is about, finding that which makes a difference to the collaborators you will need as partners in implementing this comprehensive system of reform. I just want to also offer that, well, no, let's move to the next slide. I'm sorry. And as we do, maybe offer the next poll question, please. Jenny, am I not seeing the next poll question? There we go. What am I doing? Challenging the fact that Jenny might be putting that up. In your jurisdiction, please identify the top 3 primary sources of opposition to the increased use of alternative responses to formal prosecution. Top 3. I can guess from a couple of comments so far, so I'm very anxious to see what the responses are. So as that's coming up, I'm going to make a little bit of a narrative comment. These are some interesting responses. As we've learned from our technical assistance partnerships across the country, there are myriad terms applied to the alternatives to formal court processing. These include diversion, informal processing, informal adjustment, informal supervision, informal hearing, probation adjustment, probation before adjudication, deferred prosecution. Many jurisdictions, they have civil citations. There are consent decrees. That doesn't even cover the exhaustive list. But we would argue as you go forward and now have identified the research, have identified the evidence, have hopefully committed to the notion that this is a broader based approach than just a single diversion program, that it is an approach, it is a set of practices, that the following factors should be carefully considered as they likely provide compelling support for alternative responses to formal prosecution and or involvement in the juvenile justice system. This is not going to show up on the slides, so I'm going to go a little bit slowly. A historical commitment to the philosophy of diversionary practices. I'm going to argue, guys, that I think that exists in the state of Nebraska, and we've worked in a couple of jurisdictions, as some of you know, but we certainly haven't worked in all the counties, and we don't know all the county attorneys. And I'm obviously seeing that 6 out of 10 of you put in your top 3 that the prosecuting attorney is one of the reasons that would be an opposition to increased uses. We're now laying the groundwork that says you should take advantage. And I know as a consultant, I can't point my finger at you. You're supposed to not say you should and you need to, but today I'm a little different. And I'd like to argue that you should incorporate the knowledge and understanding of adolescent development. That you must start with the codified framework that exists in the state of Nebraska to identify what options do exist and what options may be limited. To the point of offense type and some of the comments, I'm not sure, Nebraska statute may include some offenses that are excluded from opportunities. You must reflect the evidence that there is overrepresentation of minority youth in the formal juvenile justice system, if that exists in your jurisdiction. I'm not going to make a blanket statement, but in many jurisdictions it does, and it's an issue that we could make some headway on if it does. It's an opportunity for you to include that in your argument of what you can impact by introducing this more comprehensive approach. I think it's important to have some sort of instrument that allows you to identify not just the offense type, as you can tell up to this point, but also the risk level. And therefore, I would argue that the introduction of some sort of validated instrument that's predictive of the risk to reoffend is fundamental to the pieces you bring to the table. I think, and we're providing it to you today, there's evidence reflecting formal involvement for low-risk youth often heightens the likelihood of reoffending. At least the argument that you could make more headway for those that you identify as low risk, or if you're not going to embrace a risk to reoffend approach, at least low risk, the offense type as a misdemeanor type, as an opportunity to expand on how many of those youth may get alternatives. The research confirming effective alternative responses and approaches. So I've been talking about the human research, the impact of penetration into the justice system, the opportunities for lower recidivism rates outside the system. But there's also a fiscal impact, and I think we can equip any one of you with some of the opportunities to translate more diversion, more successful diversion, to a fiscal impact for retention of services and interventions for the moderate and high risk offenders that do belong inside the juvenile justice system under our oversight. And finally, it does allow, in that very same statement, an improved allocation of workforce and those treatment resources for higher risk youth that are at higher risk to reoffend. So I hope those are bullet points that start to build your foundation along with what we've covered up to this point of how you can lead, how you can be the information central for why there's an opportunity to explore greater reductions to recidivism moving forward. So those are things that are kind of started to be captured on the final 7 on the slide that is before you. And I hope you use them in your effort as you move forward. Let me make sure that I've, let's see, offered prior to slide 7. So if you could offer the next poll question, please. Oh, hold on, Jenny, I'm sorry. I hope everyone has had a chance to react. I did make reference to 62% prosecuting or county attorney. I see 48% community members. That I hope is reflective, or at least that's the way I set it up, that community members might be those that are advocating for more strict action, more harsh action, or more honoring, in a better light, more honoring of victims that must be considered. well, of course, 37% is victim rights, but I can assure you that alternative responses, particularly in a restorative justice approach, still adhere to the notion that victims have rights and that victims often are important in teaching the accountability of the youth for his or her action as well. I appreciate your answers on that. It is interesting to see that it doesn't surprise me, law enforcement. I'm liking the low numbers on judges and probation officers, but I'm frankly just a little bit surprised that in both instances, one of your top three primary sources of opposition would be judges and probation officers. Again, unfortunately, I'm not in front of you. We can't have that live back and forth, but interesting observations, and I hope maybe you all are trying to interpret the same way as well.
John, did you want to look at the comments?
Yeah.
There's some clarification that looks like it's needed.
Yeah. And I think it's the clarification. Is it the clarification? I think, Dan, you've offered the clarification. No, I am not saying that no matter the crime, the juvenile should be offered diversion. That's simply not real. Can't be a reality. Statutorily, in some jurisdictions, it's not a reality. Even practically, in working with a county attorney or prosecution, or all the partners may not have that philosophical view that that should be the case. So no, I am not saying that. I am saying exactly what Dan has characterized. Individualized, incorporate the some scientific understanding of whether or not they're at risk to reoffend. And if that is high, then that should decrease the likelihood that they should be offered a diversionary approach. Okay. I hope that helps just a little bit. And I hope it's generating some of your own thinking about what it is that you truly base your diversionary decisions on. So could you move to the next poll question at this point, Jenny?
Did you want the next poll question or the next slide?
Offered. I want the next poll question.
Okay.
Oh, you know what? I'm sorry, Jenny, we rehearsed and you know better than I do. Next slide. My apologies. Hopefully some of you are giggling at home. Jenny's more informed on my own presentation than I am. Way to go, Jenny. This slide starts to capture, if we're going to present all this evidence, if we're going to try to have research, have evidence, have examination of the statute, have narrative that explains why we should at least examine as a collaborative how we can further enhance our diversionary and alternative responses, it's going to require that these people are present. And that starts to get at the heart of why I'm not talking about a diversion program. We are talking about a systematic response that increases the opportunities for youth to be treated, served, and accountable outside the juvenile justice system. I think this has been the bottom line for the participation that we need when we've done our work. And I would offer that, and again, this is not the most glitzy piece. Maybe some of you in your everyday work are going, geez, he just keeps talking at a different level, system level, but it's critical. And you are part of that system. You are a critical part of that system, no matter who you are on this line. You can be a part of this. So I'm going to offer that system integration and coordination require the involvement of those in leadership position, those who possess expertise in particular areas. I hope I end up capturing everybody that's in this session as I lay these out. Those who make filing decisions on a daily basis, those who inform filing decisions, those who display a passion for embracing the most targeted, effective, and efficient use of human and fiscal resources to serve the youth at the front end of the system. And that may be community partners as well. So to build this essential body of participants, I'm arguing the following steps should be taken. And it should be, as you can see from this body of core folks, that we must identify the specific individuals who can serve on, and this gets right back to our 5 steps, on an alternative response team. And of course, we're in the youth justice system, so everything has an acronym, to the ART, as key leaders throughout the initiative. At a minimum, leaders from the prosecutorial office, the clerk's office, intake, judiciary, probation must participate. Additional individuals are going to need to be administrator of the court, representation from education, often a referral source. Law enforcement is clearly a referral source. As I mentioned earlier, child welfare. Identify those most relevant individuals to participate in individual or group interviews. Those participants should be from the entities that I referenced above, who have a vested interest in serving both pre-file and pre-adjudication youth, and will actively work to explore opportunities for improvements. Who am I talking about there? In order to get the input, we need to reach out to families, to parents, to community providers, to school resource officers, to blocks of intake officers. Because you guys identified other parties as well, it may be probation officers that we need to speak to. They have a clear understanding of who's moved on into formal supervision and who may not need to be in underneath that oversight of their formal probation supervision. But this collaborative, this map, involves the leadership team of the ART, decision makers, action oriented, opportunity to drive the work forward. And it must be informed by this second group, on the ground, people who do the everyday work, people who are invested in bringing about the change. And then if we can get that alternative response team together, and we can identify some of the other stakeholders who we need to have access to secure their input, then we started to create a foundation for a community approach to alternative responses. And what we outline in our alternative response is that plan a launch event where you present through the alternative response leadership to all the stakeholders in the community, present the research, the evidence, the opportunity, the harm, present all the evidence that would suggest collectively we can create a pathway to finding more alternative responses that also produces better outcomes, that does produce accountability for that youth, that does undercut further recidivism and further risk to reoffend, does take care of victim rights, and does ultimately protect the community the way in which we're charged with protecting the community. That would be my argument right at the outset. Now, I'm certain many of you would say, look, I'm an intake officer, I'm a probation officer, I'm a this or I'm a that. Well, if you see yourself as not significant enough, which I refute, to start to make the argument or start to build the case for, if you do that, certainly you have a supervisor, a manager, a director that you could go to, that put them in a position with the information that they could start to mobilize in this way. I don't think any of us are disconnected from being a part of moving this effort forward, no matter where you see yourself in the system. Because I think everybody in this call plays a key role in changing the outcomes for youth and families and protecting our community. So I think I've covered that slide, and prior to this particular slide, let me see if I'm missing anything. Shouldn't a huge part of the entire discussion be that juvenile must be held accountable, correct? I hope, Kim, I've continued to address that accountability is a part of the solution. I'm not asking to release or absolve the youth of accountability. I'm merely suggesting that the evidence would suggest there are alternative ways to hold that youth accountable. The brain science would suggest that they respond they are accountable, held accountable in ways that we may not have traditionally practiced, that are just as effective, in fact, more effective. And I'm suggesting that accountability may hide behind a particular rock and come out and say accountability can be produced through incentives to change the behavior, where they learn what it was that they did was negative, had a negative impact, and learn how to exercise judgment in a different way. That's accountability, and that contributes to public safety if we reduce their future risk to reoffend. So I don't think it's either or. I think it's a combination of all, and I think that's part of the argument that needs to move the field as I present this pathway to an increased opportunity for alternative responses. And quite simply, when I get through this argument, I land on the research is really clear. And let me be clear, I'm not a theorist. As a practitioner for 20 years, and we're in jurisdictions where I'm interacting with you almost every day of my professional life within the National Resource Center. Research is merely the compilation of evidence on what it is that we do every day, what it is you do every day. So research is not a foreign concept. Research is what we do, and it's consolidated in a way that shows whether or not it's successful or impactful. So I'm not disassociating myself from that. but I land on the research a lot because it's much more valuable than my opinion. And the truth is, these alternatives for the properly targeted with the proper identification of service interventions and resources is much more effective for many of these youth than entering them formally into the juvenile justice system. It just is. It's a fact. Okay. Um, so let me move on to the poll question. Actually, let me see if I should respond to this question, Jenny. I think there'll be a push in the future to divert kids age 19 to 24 that we know are still in. I think everyone can see the question. And yes, actually, Stacy, there already is in some jurisdictions. As you properly pointed out, this, and I did at the outset, this brain science recognizes that from 6 to 24, all those brain developments are still in active stages. They're not in a maturation place in the prefrontal cortex. So they're still maturing in that period of time. The percentage of youth, of young adults, age 18 to 24, of the overall adult criminal justice system is extraordinary. We are working with one of our consultant partners is heading a national initiative out of University of Loyola at Illinois on emerging adults and taking advantage of this science to suggest within the criminal justice system how we might create better approaches to the 18 to 24-year-olds that are becoming involved in the criminal justice system. So I do think not just the emergence of the emerging adults notion, taking advantage of this research, but once again, the Supreme Court has established a long-standing foundation. And I say long-standing, it's been 10, 12, 13 years for some of these Supreme Court decisions that have been based on this science that lead us in the direction that during this period, we at least need to consider this brain development and its impact on decision-making and culpability, not accountability, but culpability in how we address them. So yes, it's starting to have an impact into that criminal justice system for 18 to 24-year-olds as well. Great question. Jenny, if you could you move to poll question prior to slide number 8?
Yeah, did you want to address Kim's question about definitions of public safety? Or do you want to go to the poll next?
Let's come back to that. Okay. Sorry, Kim. I'm realizing we're down to our last 20 minutes and I'll come back to that. There's 4 questions here. I know what my state statutory language is regarding the use of diversion. True or false? Criteria, eligibility. I'm hoping I see a lot more green in our lovely donut here than I do red. If not, whoever's red, I'm gonna ask you what you need to know, and I'm gonna do some research on the Nebraska statute and provide some background to you. I hope that wasn't offensive. I didn't mean that offensive. It was, I'm liking to see that 3/4 of you would answer, yeah, I do know what the statutory language is regarding diversion. And I specifically put in the criteria, the eligibility.
I closed that poll. Do you just want me to launch the next one?
Awesome. Yes, I'm glad to see that many of you have that awareness that you know criteria and eligibility in the state of Nebraska. Yes, next question. I know what our policy and philosophy is regarding the use of diversion in our court jurisdiction. Now that's a 2, philosophy, or policy and philosophy. That's 2. That may limit the yeses, but policy and philosophy. True or false? Eight out of 10. If we were in a place where we were together, I might ask the follow-up, if there's 1 out of 5 of you, and right now it's about 1 out of 6 or 1 out of 7, that don't know the policy and philosophy, I'd want to know why. And it wouldn't be to question your knowledge, your awareness, your understanding. It would be to question why that hasn't been communicated clearly to you, that you would be among 1 out of 7, which is actually pretty significant in my mind, that you're not clear on that. I'm making the point that I think it's important that everyone in the system understand what that policy and what that philosophy is that drives the policy. I know what the process is for youth who are diverted from a petition or an adjudication process. And that's, the process as an example, the assignment, the length, the conditions. What's the process look like? I know what that is for diverted youth. Yes or no? True or false, rather? Excellent. I'm going to go with that. I like that kind of, that again, there's some obvious awareness, some knowledge, what you should be doing, what your responsibility is, what your task is. That's good to see. Really appreciate that. Next poll question. I know what outcomes we are achieving with youth who are diverted from formal prosecution. Really anxious to see the answer to this. All right, I may advertise my age right here by making this comment, but it's cleaner than what I would normally say if I was at a bar with you. But if I'm looking at 85% of you saying you know the outcomes, I'm going to say, holy schmoly. And you might guess what I would replace that second word with. Then you guys are outpacing and outdistancing almost everybody else around the country. The question was there particularly because we rarely track what's happening to those kids that we are diverting formally from the juvenile justice system. Now, for a variety of reasons, it may be because we're diverting them to some sort of community service and we don't track it. And the only way we track it is if they come back in. And even then, there's, in most instances, we see really inadequate tracking of whether or not that person had a prior diversion that was unsuccessful. So 85%, I'm just going to have to accept on face and say that's very impressive. If we were hanging out, I might ask, so detail what those outcomes actually are that you are achieving from these diversions from formal prosecution. But it's something that we'll pay attention to, and it's coming up on this very next slide. So thanks for those answers, telling, informative, and actually provide some grist for me to probably be curious to ask you further questions if I get the chance. Next slide, please. So these are the methodologies. Look, we try to make it simple. I may have tried to make it complicated in 65, 75 minutes so far, but I'm trying to lay out all the foundational pieces. You don't build a deck without getting your foundation approved. You got to dig the footers, you got to plant the footers, you got to prove that they're deep enough, you got to stabilize them. You got to do all that before you're going to be successful in having a stable deck that will last, that will achieve what you tried to achieve by building it in the first place. I've tried to establish the strongest possible foundation, folks, for how it is that you go forward. And a lot of that is research, philosophy, policy, practice, statute, all those kinds of things. They kind of have to come together, and then they have to be presented to a leadership team that we're calling an alternative response team. And I think I've just tried to lay out that the second piece of this process that gets in front of that alternative response team or starts to be part of the conversation that leads you to these comprehensive solutions or additional alternatives that you can develop. It does require the procedural, the policy, the statute, but it also requires the data. I don't know how many times you guys have sat in meetings where the loudest voice in the room is standing on his or her own personal philosophy based on anecdotal experiences. And you might be sitting there saying, but there's another 9 out of 10 cases that you're not referring to that present a very different picture. I think it's important when you bring a collaborative together that you produce the data. Just yesterday in the Milwaukee discussion, we had a data dashboard, and it was telling that they looked at, as I've shared some of the information, 66% of those cases were low risk or misdemeanants, and they were only diverting 26% of their cases. Their chief judge said, that provides me with the impetus to argue there's a significant gap in the number of kids we might afford or offer alternative responses to formal prosecution. More of the data showed the remarkable disproportionality of African-American youth in Milwaukee versus those that were not of color, that were being afforded diversion versus African-American youth not. So some telling data that informs the discussion is really important, and that's step number 2. Those key stakeholder interviews that I've referenced in our guidebook, we think we've laid out some protocols to give you some guidance on page 19 and 20 for the kinds of questions to get at the kind of information we think is important from among the stakeholders who have everyday knowledge, like many of you, of what's going on in the field, what's going on directly in working with youth, families, communities, law enforcement, resource providers. But these key stakeholder interviews further inform so that we're not making decisions based, once again, on one or two voices that have a particular inclination. It's okay in this environment that I'm suggesting we challenge those inclinations, we challenge those positions, and arrive collaboratively based on research, data, evidence, policies, procedures that are in place. This may not be the most appealing to everyone. I happen to be a bit of a geek, and so do many of our consultants, but we love the notion of process mapping. Identify the key decision points, and you guys indicated earlier, with some 80 or 90% certainty, you knew the process. Well, let's articulate what that process is so everybody that has a stake in this creation of additional alternative responses and approaches and service provision that produces greater accountability, greater public safety, and more opportunities to find that through alternative responses. Let's do that by targeting what we know about the current decision-making process and then identifying where it is we can enhance and improve those processes, and have every one of the stakeholders who's going to be impacted by this understand what that map looks like and what their responsibilities are in contributing to each of those key decisions. Step number 5 here identifies the intake, the court officer group interviews. Made a couple of veiled references. I was a probation officer, intake officer, probation supervisor, actually ultimately administrator at a 22-bed residential treatment facility. I considered myself on the ground for nearly 20 years doing this work. I have an affinity for the opinions, the viewpoints, the perspectives of all of those folks who did the job that I just identified I was doing for a while. I think your perspective, your expertise is invaluable. So yeah, we included that in this process. We cannot miss those intake court officer group interviews, as well as our community stakeholders and our families in informing what might be best in our local jurisdiction. And then in the end, this identifies a process that says, even though, as I said, I might have challenged that 85% of you knew the youth outcomes, I would challenge that in most instances, we don't see that. And part of this process is to clearly identify, even before we walk through steps 2, 3, 4, and 5, back to the development of the alternative response team, this leadership group should be clear. This is what we're seeking. These are our goals. These are objectives. And these are the youth outcomes and the system performance outcomes that we're going to be held accountable for once we develop these approaches. Okay. We think that's critically important to define that early on, because it'll likely drive what kinds of activities will achieve those kind of outcomes. And then a key piece of what we do in working together, and you have some benefits across the state of Nebraska with some of your data collection systems. I know I might get scrunched faces from many of you about what that data actually produces, but there are benefits, there are opportunities to routinely collect data that tells us whether or not we're achieving those outcomes moving forward. Okay, so look, I give a little thread ribbon up to the top. We lay out some terms that at least help you understand where am I in this 5-step process, where am I in these methodologies. Well, these are some of the methodologies in the preparation, the analysis, the ultimate production of findings, with action planning on what you want to do to implement and achieve the desired goals and results. I think that's logical. I think that makes sense. It's often tough to work through in an environment because you're competing with your everyday responsibilities. Sometimes the priorities that supplant the notion of a systemic approach to change on another initiative like this. It's challenging. We provide support for how you can effectively build that implementation infrastructure to take what you develop, put it into place, sustain it, measure it, and then sustain it more if those measurements are telling you you're being successful. I often argue that many of you may not present yourselves as experts in system change, experts in project development, maintenance, and sustainability, but you can't become an expert until you become part of that process. And part of that process requires everybody on this call's expertise to be engaged, to be involved, to be informed. So I'll stop the preaching. Let me give you a couple of quick examples, but let me offer this last poll question if I could. Jenny, you can go ahead with this poll question. There we go. Thank you. I believe our court jurisdiction must improve its approach to alternative responses to formal prosecution through evidence-based diversionary practices. I'm curious where you stand, how you would answer that right now. Awesome. I hope the number stays in the 9s. So there's room. What I'm seeing early, oh, it's up to 89. Somebody else get to the, there we go. There's a belief that we can improve the practice. There's a belief that we might be able to explore more. I'm not, and I've seen some of the comments, certainly, I don't want to impose in my presentation that it must be that, yeah, you better offer that to everybody. That's the way we do this. No, 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 not at all. I'm offering that there's a collaborative approach that would allow us to design something that can be embraced by everybody in your jurisdiction. It takes hard work. That would then charge an informed group with developing the specific policies and procedures that would find ways to explore those additional opportunities for alternative responses. Peggy, I love the positive response. I really appreciate that. On the right track, always looking for more alternatives. That may be true of everybody that's on the call. You may be on the right track, but there's room for improvement. Milwaukee thought that they were on the right track, and that one data point suggested, well, we may have a bit more of our journey to travel before we get there. Next poll question, please, Jenny. I believe I can begin to impact progress on this topic through my own professional actions. And I put this on here within the next 90 days. Do you believe you could impact that change within the next 90 days? I'm loving this. I wanted that number to be as close as possible to the number on the preceding poll question. If you believe there's room for improvement or room for opportunity, and you believe you can impact this progress, then I welcome the chance to be a part of a phone conversation, email exchange, any kind of minutia or detailed exchange with you that might further provide impetus for you to drive this forward. This may seem like a distant presentation. We're the RFK National Resource Center. Heck, my home office is in Virginia. I'm a long way from you. I will be back in Nebraska several more times over the next several months, but I'm a long way from you. But I'm just as close as a phone call and an email to have an individual conversation with you, either to answer questions that you still have after this presentation about some of the premises that I laid out or the process that I'm offering, or to support what next step you might be able to take, or to connect you with a mentor who is in the exact place you are, has experienced this in another jurisdiction, and took those affirmative steps and now can attest to some of the results. So I love to see that 85% of you believe you can make progress. I'd love to support that in any way going forward. So, next slide, please. One might argue that I should have spent a lot more time on this slide than all the foundation pieces that we've spent coming up to this point. We have only 6 or 7 minutes left, but I'm not going to convince you solely on the basis that somebody else did this work somewhere else, where you might say, that don't look like us at all. But at the very least, I have to have an attestation to the fact that these very things that I've talked with you about, that you've commented on today, have been overcome, have been put in place, have been successfully implemented, sustained, measured, and continued to impact these youth. I'm going to tell you about the top 2 in the next couple of minutes. Now, I've got a little bit of a narrative. I want to read this to you. You'll find in the Alternative Response Initiative workbook much of what I've covered today. And these first 2 examples, we have a shadow box that expands even further. Actually, this Jefferson Parish example has an appendix all to its own to capture 10 years worth of data, success on the approach. So let me share that with you real quickly. Jefferson Parish, which is a jurisdiction right outside of New Orleans, their stakeholders were encouraged by their understanding of the detrimental effects of formal system processing and the setup that led them to believe that they could make a change, which is where 85 and 90% of you feel you may be today. So they looked at data to identify the most significant contributors to youth in their formal system. They found, first, school arrests were highlighted in that data because of the high number of youth arrested at school. And we were working with them at the time they did this. This was back in 08 through 2011. For a 4-year period, they were averaging nearly 40% of their overall delinquent referrals were coming from schools. Think of that. 4 out of every 10 were coming from schools in a jurisdiction just outside of New Orleans. So following the data, crisis intervention training for youth was ultimately implemented for law enforcement officers that were working within schools on their campuses. As a result, over the next 3 years, their data reflected that school arrests declined 36%. Those law enforcement officers in schools were trained differently. The schools offered different alternatives within the school. They offered services and interventions for treatment. And the first response of those schools was not to take that alleged behavior and file a petition, but they were trying to address it inside the school setting. Further, the district attorney had taken the position that I won't entertain a petition for these types of offenses. And they identified 3 offenses, which were more than half of the kinds of offenses coming from school related. And you can guess what they were: disruption of school, assault, those kinds of things. That the district attorney said, I'm not going to take those until you've walked through these processes of trying to treat and resolve the issues inside the school setting. School arrests declined 36%. Second, data showed more youth were referred for prosecution than diversion in the Jefferson Parish system. At the time of inquiry, there were 380 cases referred to pretrial diversion compared to 550 youth who were on probation. The DA's office developed objective criteria for diverting cases from formal processing, enhanced the pretrial diversion programming to include mental health interventions, restorative justice approaches, cognitive skill building efforts, and the previously referenced school-based service intervention. As a result, 5 years into the process, the number of youth referred to the pretrial diversion program increased by 54%. With the increase in cases referred to pretrial diversion, the number of new cases referred to probation declined, and 5 years later, over a 10-year scan, the probation cases were at their lowest rate since 1990 as a result of this diversion. Their recidivism rates overall were half the recidivism rates they were experiencing when they started this effort. So public safety, alternatives to formal involvement, all manner of approaches, all manners of partnerships with district attorney, with law enforcement, with schools, created some of the most impressive and sustainable 10-year data sets that we've seen across the country. And this comes from the deputy director, the impact of this transformative process expanded the pretrial program, currently receives a wider variety of youth with charges ranging from misdemeanors to low-level offenses. Referrals to their diversion programming are coordinated through the DA's office following an arrest. And data as recently as 2018 in the school showed the DA's office diverted 47% of school arrests that were even brought to them after the requirements of intervention within the school. In Fairfax County, which is the jurisdiction in which I worked, they have an alternative accountability program directly with law enforcement. I was working with them this week. We were sitting down with their leadership group, and once again, they are expanding that alternative accountability beyond a 2 kind of program approach from law enforcement to include restorative justice, specific educational programs that are sponsored by the court and the community pro-social supports, which I referenced earlier, in terms of YMCA, in terms of mental health, substance abuse interventions, of family therapeutic interventions, all of those kinds of supports, as well as the pro-social school activities, church activities, athletic activities, and as well as expanding their relationship with their community-based service provision partnership that provides additional therapeutic interventions for these youth. They're looking to expand an alternative accountability program that up to this point, over 3 years, for all the youth that went through that AAP program with law enforcement, instead of being referred to the court, they have a 94% success rate for youth not reoffending over the course of the year. Folks, there are other examples that are listed on here. All of them very systematic. In Clark County, Nevada, they have created a harbor, which now harbors 12, like a juvenile assessment center. Sean, that should appeal to you. A juvenile assessment center that intakes many of their complaints, as opposed to juvenile intake in the court taking their complaints. and their early data on thousands of kids being impacted over the last 3 years in Las Vegas is very impressive. We're at the bottom of the hour. I don't want to take any more time than what you offered. And yet I wanted to make sure that it is this kind of process that Carrie and I wrote about in this alternative response initiative that was created after we learned from these jurisdictions of how they did that. And all of the points that I've made today that seem to be that path to success for creating greater alternatives to formal prosecution. And in line with that, greater community accountability or community safety, greater accountability for those youth, in many instances, particularly tied to the victim's rights, the victim's opportunities, certainly a reduction of reoffending, as I've spoken with probably not the level of detail that you would want to hear from me, but all of these aspects that are part of what I think we strive to achieve in a really positive juvenile justice system are things that are now being practiced in place, realizing results. I have no doubt that Nebraska has the framework, the leadership, the people, and folks like you that could create those kind of opportunities in your local jurisdiction as well. Okay, I think I'm going to exhale. And I hope that you end up finding some of this information helpful to you, some of this session helpful to you. This is where you can contact either me or Carrie. I think you'll find that we are passionately committed and love working with every single person we get the privilege of working with around the country. And wherever we can make a difference, we'd love to be a part of it. So I wish you the best of luck. Jenny, I'm not sure I'm supposed to do anything else before I simply say thanks to everyone. I hope to see you somewhere down the road in our work in Nebraska. I can at least tell you that there are a couple of grants that have been funded that we're going to get to partner with the state of Nebraska on. So I just might get to run into you in your own local jurisdiction in the near future, and I look forward to that. Otherwise, best of luck to you. Stay safe, stay well. I appreciate your time.
Thank you, John. I don't see any comments coming in at the moment. We'll give people just 1 minute.
Oh, I see. I see the thank you and the thank you. I love those.
Yeah.
And Sean, you behave yourself and take care of yourself. It's great to see you on this session.
All right. I think we will close. Thanks, guys.
Jenny, thank you very much. Bye, everybody.